Hey everyone! Ready for something kind of mind-blowing? We're going deep today on how the whole idea of worship has totally changed. From ancient gods and all that, all the way to, well, get this, modern day idols.
Yeah, you'd be surprised, right? The source we're looking at today really dives into this whole idea that humans, we have this deep need to find meaning, And without the traditional gods, we've kind of shifted our focus to other things, turning them into idols.
Idols, huh?
Yeah.
So not just golden statues and stuff. I mean, what even comes to mind when you say that word nowadays?
Right. Not exactly those ancient statues, no. It's more think about those things or people we give this almost godlike status to. The source actually uses a really interesting example, Michael Jackson. Fans fainting at his concerts.
Yeah.
And it wasn't from divine power or anything. It was this intense, almost religious-like connection they felt to him.
Wow, that's kind of crazy when you put it that way. So wait, are we saying that celebrities are our new gods then?
I mean, it's not quite that simple. See, the source digs into the psychology of this whole shift. Back in the day, people created gods to explain the things they didn't understand, right? Storms, earthquakes, all that stuff they couldn't control.
It's like they were hitting a big someone's in charge button to calm themselves down. I can see that.
Exactly. And worshiping those gods together, it brought communities closer, gave them these shared rituals and beliefs, But then, as science came along, those old gods started to feel, less relevant.
So we traded in Zeus for, a fancy sports car?
It's more like a shift in what gives us that feeling of belonging, of purpose. Without a universal god, maybe we lash onto those things we can actually see. Touch that car and design our handbag, the perfect Instagram feed, all that. The source even argues that we try to become like our idols, copying their lifestyles, values, maybe even losing ourselves a little bit in the process.
Whoa, losing ourselves. That seems kind of intense.
The source talks about celebrity culture, right? It's we're bombarded with images of these perfect lives, and it's so easy to compare, to feel like we need to measure up. Ever felt that pressure, online, to fit in, to be like someone else?
Ugh, all the time. Scrolling through social media can make you feel like you're just not good enough. Is that what the source is saying? That these modern idols can mess with how we see ourselves?
Absolutely, and it goes even deeper than that. The source is saying that this shift in what we worship, it even changes how we think about right and wrong.
Okay, now I'm really listening. What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If there's no longer this universal God setting the rules, morality becomes relative. What's considered good just becomes whatever is popular in the moment, whatever the loudest voices are saying.
So right and wrong just depend on who you ask. That sounds, kind of chaotic, to be honest.
And that's the whole point the source is making. It's we've lost our moral compass, right? Without those fixed principles, everything gets blurry. How are we even supposed to know what's right and wrong in a world like that?
That's a big question for sure. And I guess it leads to an even bigger one. If we're not worshiping gods and everything's relative, then what is our purpose? Where do we go from here? Does the source offer any answers?
It actually does, and it's a really interesting one, I think. The source brings up the idea of the Baha'i faith as a possible answer to this whole crisis of meaning and identity. This faith, it focuses on the oneness of humanity and having a universal moral code that comes from God.
So an anchor in all this uncertainty. Tell me more.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The Baha'i faith basically says that God is the source of all meaning, and those divine teachings, they guide us ethically. The source even mentions this really interesting idea called progressive revelation.
You know what? I think we've covered a lot of ground already. Let's pause here and come back to that progressive revelation idea in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, that sounds good. There's definitely a lot more to unpack there. Okay, so we were talking about progressive revelation.
Yeah.
This idea is actually a really important part of how the Baha'i faith tackles these big questions we've been discussing, about meaning and morality and all that.
Yeah, you mentioned it right before we paused, but honestly, I'm still not totally clear on what progressive revelation actually means. Could you break it down a bit more?
Sure. So basically, the source explains that in the Baha'i faith, the way God guides humanity, it's revealed gradually over time through these series of prophets or messengers.
Okay, so it's not just one set of rules forever set in stone. God's guidance kind of evolves as humanity does.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so relevant to what we're talking about here with all these changing values and stuff. Each messenger, they build on what those before them taught, refining the message, adapting it to fit the needs of the time. For example, the Baha'i teachings, they really stress equality between men and women. That's something that probably wouldn't have made much sense centuries ago.
That's pretty radical, especially for a religion, right? So if each messenger brings new teachings, does that mean that people who follow the Baha'i faith are always like throwing out their old beliefs?
Oh, no, not at all. The source really makes it clear that the core ideas of the Baha'i faith, those stay the same. Things like the oneness of humanity, how important justice is, striving for unity. It's more about, expanding our understanding of those principles and figuring out how they apply to the world today, since it's constantly changing.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how this ties back to that whole universal moral code idea. So what does that actually look like? Are there like specific rules that everyone has to follow?
Well, the source doesn't get into all the super specific laws or anything, but it highlights some of the core values behind this universal code. Like getting rid of prejudice, whether it's about race, religion, gender, or whatever, and trying to create a society that's just and peaceful. There's a big emphasis on education, too, and using knowledge to help humanity, and also on things like consultation and dialogue to solve problems.
Those all sound like pretty solid principles to me. Pretty universal, too, right? I mean, who's going to argue against wanting peace and justice?
That's exactly the point the source is making. These are supposed to be principles that resonate with everybody, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's not about forcing people to follow a bunch of rules, but appealing to our shared humanity,
Yeah, okay, I get that. But let's be real for a minute here. Even if we all agree on those big ideas, people are going to disagree about how to actually, put them into practice, right? So how does the Baha'i faith deal with that, with conflict and people having different viewpoints?
That's a great question, and the source actually does touch on that a bit. Instead of having, a top-down authority or just dogma, the Baha'i teachings emphasize consultation and dialogue. It's about individuals coming together, sharing their perspectives, and trying to reach some kind of consensus.
So less about forcing people to agree and more about finding some common ground.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical approach, especially these days, when it seems like everyone is just talking past each other. But the source is suggesting that this type of open communication, it's really crucial if we want to build trust and get to the unity we need to solve these complex problems we're facing.
Yeah, I can see how that would be super valuable, but also maybe kind of hard to actually do, I mean, can a faith that's relatively new, like the Baha'i faith, can it actually make a difference on a global scale? The world often seems so focused on conflict and just looking out for number one.
It's a valid question, and the source definitely isn't claiming to have all the answers. But it does mention how the Baha'i community is getting more and more involved in all sorts of initiatives around the world, like peace initiatives, interfaith dialogues, and social action campaigns.
So it's not just about talking the talk, they're actually walking the walk too.
Exactly. The source emphasizes how the Baha'i faith isn't supposed to be passive, where you just withdraw from the world. It actually encourages people to get involved, to work with others to build a better world. And that, I think, is what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. It's challenging us to think about worship not just as this personal thing, but as something that goes beyond us, that can shape the world we live in.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground today. From ancient gods to modern idols, then this whole idea of universal moral code, and now we're talking about the Baha'i faith as a way to actually put these ideas into practice. It's a lot to take in.
It really is, and I think it sets us up perfectly for our last part, where you can really zoom in and look at what all of this means for us, on an individual level. How can we take these insights and use them in our own lives? How can we become more aware of what we're worshiping, both literally and figuratively, and make choices that help us lead more meaningful lives?
That sounds pretty interesting to me. Let's get into it. Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive, and I gotta say, I'm ready to get a little more practical. We've talked about these ancient gods, modern idols, this whole idea of progressive revelation, and how the Baha'i faith sees a universal moral code. But how do we actually take all this, heady stuff and make it work in our own lives?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? And the source we've been looking at, I think it does a really good job of making us think about those real-world implications. It's not just about theory. It's about, inspiring us to actually look inside ourselves and make some changes.
So less armchair philosophy, more like rolling up our sleeves and getting to work.
Exactly. Remember earlier we were talking about how without a universal God, people tend to look for meaning and validation in all sorts of other places, like celebrity culture, or wanting all these material possessions.
Yeah, and it honestly made me think about how easy it is to get caught up in all that. I mean, I know I spend way too much time on social media comparing myself to everyone else's, perfectly curated lives.
And that's a perfect example of what the Source is talking about. It's like, it's challenging us to really look at our own lives and ask ourselves, what are we putting up on a pedestal? Where are we putting all our time and energy, even our devotion? Are those things really that important?
Okay, so let's say we realize we've been giving too much power to certain things. Maybe we've even built a few idols without even realizing it. What do we do next? How do we get out of that trap?
Well, the Source has a few suggestions, and I think they're pretty powerful. The first one is about building up a strong sense of self.
So like knowing who you are and what you believe in, not letting all that outside noise tell you how you should feel about yourself.
Exactly. When you have that strong sense of self-worth, you're less likely to get swayed by all those passing trends or feel like you need to constantly prove yourself to everyone.
Makes sense, but how do you actually do that? It's easy to say, be more confident, but it's a lot harder to actually put it into practice, you know?
That's where the second suggestion comes in. The Source talks about connecting to something bigger than ourselves, something that can give us perspective and help us find that deeper sense of meaning that I think we all crave.
Okay, I'm starting to see a theme here. Are we heading back to the Baha'i faith again?
Well, the Source definitely points to faith as one way to find that connection, but it's not just about any one religion. It could be anything that helps you tap into that sense of awe and wonder, Maybe it's spiritual practices, connecting with nature, being part of a community that shares your values.
I like that. It's like remembering that we're part of something so much bigger than our own little world.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, it can be incredibly freeing. It helps us let go of those things we might have been, kind of idolizing and focus on what really matters.
So we're building self-awareness, connecting to something bigger than ourselves. What's the last piece of this puzzle?
Action. The Source is really clear on this. Real meaning and fulfillment that come from living a life of service. It's not enough to just think about these ideas. We have to actually do something with them.
So it's not just about talking the talk, it's about walking the walk.
Exactly. It could be anything, really. Volunteering, advocating for something you believe in, or even just being more mindful and compassionate in your daily life. It's about using what you're good at, your talents, to make a positive impact on the world around you.
Wow. This whole conversation has been quite a journey, honestly. We started with this question about how worship has changed over time and ended up talking about some really deep stuff, like meaning, purpose, and the power we have to make our own choices.
It's true. And what I really like about this deep dive is that it leaves us with more questions than answers, It's like an invitation to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and to keep trying to live a life that's in line with our values.
So as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this question. What idols have you built in your own life, maybe without even realizing it? And what can you do, even if it's something small, to start taking those apart and creating something more meaningful?
It's time to really look at things with a fresh perspective, to question the things we might be taking for granted, and to embrace that power we have to make a difference through service.
Well, that's a wrap on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you enjoyed exploring these ideas with us, and we encourage you to keep digging deeper, keep asking those questions, and keep working towards a world that reflects the best of what humanity can be. Until next time.